From the beginning of Confederation in 1867 to now, is Canada better than it was before? A question that only studying history can answer. For centuries, people of different languages, cultures, backgrounds, and lifestyles came together in Canada. But was Canada always welcoming of these changes? Despite all of that, immigrants continued to build a society where communities could grow, thrive, unite, and become one as Canadians. There were steps along the way that caused struggling times for Canada, including the hard time for the Aboriginals, Black Canadians, Japanese Canadians, and the many more racism towards other communities such as Chinese Canadians. But for the most part, Canada became an example to the world of an up-to-date, modern society of which we live in today. Therefore, I believe that Canada is a better place now than it was before. But the biggest question remains, and is history repeating itself yet again?
Andre Campbell, Michael Elgin, Dwayne Christian, just three of many Black Canadians involved in use of force cases involving police in Canada, each one under the age of 30.
Today outside the apartment building where police killed Ijaz Ahmed Chowdhury.
We want justice for Ijaz!
The family says the father of four had schizophrenia and other medical conditions, but posed
and then heard Regis cry out, "Mom, help, mom, help, mom, help."
A mother's heartbreak, a tragedy that began when she called the police for help.
My daughter ended up dead.
When you look at the current videos of the markets that show Canada's current diversity and multiculturalism, you see a country that welcomes everyone and does not discriminate against anyone. Many Canadians from different backgrounds enjoy the multiculturalism and learning about other countries. That didn't come very easy though. When Chinese, Japanese, South Asians, and Black Canadians wanted to immigrate to Canada, they were labeled as unable and unfit to assimilate in Canada. In British Columbia, Asians were labeled as inferior and aliens from the 1850s to the 1950s. Organized labor groups claimed Asians took jobs from whites and lowered living standards for all workers because they were willing to work for less money than white workers. Asians were excluded from most unions and policy employers and paid Asian workers less than others. As Japan grew a bigger enemy to Canada in World War II, it started to reflect on Japanese Canadians. Even before the war, Japanese Canadians didn't have the right to vote, were treated as second-class citizens, weren't allowed to teach or work in the civil service and other professions. In March of 1942, the Canadian government sent Japanese Canadians to internment camps with terrible conditions that some couldn't survive. Their children and wives were sent to detention centers away from them, and their properties were confiscated, leaving them without a place to live, without land that they possibly had built businesses in, and they were paid well below the average wage with 25 cents a day. When the war ended, they had no place to stay, and many of them were sent back to Japan. As a result of World War II, Italian Canadians were under attack by Canadians as enemies and traitors, although they were loyal to Canada. These were often physical attacks. The discrimination came from the Canadian government as well. Hundreds of Italian Canadians were arrested and interned without any evidence of criminal activities or actions to support their prison time. Their businesses and homes were sold off in the process. Even worse, thousands of them had their citizenship taken away from them and were immediately classified as enemy aliens. Immigrants who had just arrived were often left with the impression that people thought they were going to kill them or enforce fascist rules on them in the workplace. The experiences that Indigenous communities faced in residential schools and outside of residential schools explains a lot about Canada's development from a very harsh society and a racist society that no one knew what segregation meant or the word racism meant. Many residential school survivors faced troubles after leaving those schools, and some of them were not able to blend in with everyone when they went home. Like, they government promised they would. They faced physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse by the workers there. They emotionally abused them by forcing them to not speak their native tongue and only speak English or French with the other children in the residential schools. Although Canada has made drastic improvements into being a more multicultural country, many people to this day experience racism within their own communities, work, etc.
Struggles with racism and injustice. Many here have experienced it firsthand.
I don't feel
A survey conducted by Vancouver Courier shows that more than 2 in 5 Canadians say they have experienced racism in the country in day-to-day social interactions, about 49% of them, at school, 43%, or at work, 41%. Finding a job isn't easy either, as it was also reported that almost 4 in 5 Canadians of African ancestry, 78%, have endured racism at the workplace, along with 70% of First Nations and 68% of Southeast Asians. These statistics are eye-opening, as we might think that Canada is free from racism, but in reality, multiculturalism and accepting people for who they are is a work in progress despite the vast improvements that have occurred. Nevertheless, Canada has made drastic improvements and it deserves to be deemed as an improved country with less racism than before. For decades, women have been fighting for equal roles as men. The roles changed drastically after World War I, going from the traditional housewife to serving in the front lines as nurses. But World War II was the biggest factor as to why women have equal rights in the workplace as men in the government. During World War II, men had to leave to serve the country as soldiers. Women took their places and became employed instead of their husbands.
Total wars. Canadian women played a key part. During the Second World War, over 1 million men joined the armed forces. Canada needed women to take their places and to support the battle. In response, women took on new roles to meet wartime needs. Women who worked in factories, farmed, became drivers, were in on the fight too.
Over the years, the role of women in the Canadian society has changed drastically in the past decades. But have women truly gained equality in the workforce, home, and society? On average, women put in double the hours of unpaid work than men in child and elderly care, yet their average pay wage is 74 cents per the dollar that men make. Women have proven to be equal to men, as 60% of the university graduates are females. But to this day, when 710 companies were asked whether they have a 50-50 ratio of women and men boards of supervisors, only 5 out of the 710 reported that they do. Compared to the history of their roles, women now have equal rights to men in the law, but they still get discrimination against in workplaces and the public. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Section 15 ensures the equal protection and benefit of the law. It says, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. In addition, Section 28 guarantees that all rights covered in the Charter apply equally to men and women. Despite all of these rights that are provided by the law and the government, research suggests that despite spending equivalent time at a job, women are significantly less likely than men to be promoted. The role of women has improved, but gender stereotypes remain an issue. Canada's economy wasn't always stable and went through some downfalls and booms throughout the years due to World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II. Before World War I, Canada was in debt due to a drought, which caused a loss in wheat crops, causing farmers to lose more money than expected. In addition, In 1915, 50,000 railway workers lost their jobs due to Canada's railway debt. To make up for that debt during the war and provide more shells and ammunition, Canada and the British government created the Imperial Munitions Board to aid the shell crisis of 1915. This helped to recover Canada's debt crisis by a little. When Canadians purchased a victory bond, all the money automatically went to the country's debt crisis. And after the war, the Patriots were refunded the original amount of money they paid along with interest. Sadly, after the war ended, Canada's economy did not jump back into shape. According to the Canadian Encyclopedia, because of the war, Canada had to pay $164 million per year to pay off their debt. Overall, Canada's total debt reached $1,665,576,000 because of the war. This resulted in many years of unemployment that took Canada 10 years to recover. During the 1920s, Canada had an economic boom due to the end of World War I. There were some indicators of financial crisis, such as the unrealistic economic expectations that were built due to the end of the war. Canada's constant supply of export goods to Europe, and easy credit that kept a lot of people in debt because of products they purchased that were too expensive to be purchased using tangible money. People had to pay for these products over time with interest added to the price. Due to the Great Depression, many people relied on easy credit. Canada's economy became vulnerable and heavily dependent on the American economy, and tariffs on import goods were raised by America. Many countries dealt with the economic crisis by imposing duties on imports. The gigantic American market was soon closed off by punishing tariffs, such as the 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was designed to protect American agriculture producers from cheaper Canadian imports. For many Canadians, however, the Depression meant great wage reductions and unemployment. Canada was dealing with another economic hit now due to COVID-19. Canada is responding well by trying to keep people safe and slowly opening businesses and cautiously going into the process without rushing. Trudeau established a $1 billion COVID-19 response fund. This investment covers economical deficits such as Unemployment Response Fund, which is the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Funding increased for the CERB or the CERB to cover costs for unemployed workers who were formerly employed but due to COVID-19 had to quit. Although Canada's unemployment has almost tripled since the start of the pandemic, the way the government is handling the pandemic's effects on the economy shows why Canada's economy has developed drastically through the years. Bennett, who was the Prime Minister of Canada, created work camps rather than focusing on the unemployment issue. Compared to now, people who are unemployed due to an emergency know that the government has their back and won't force them to work in the camps because they don't want men roaming around chasing trouble, as Bennett said during the Great Depression. Overall, Canada has developed into a better country throughout the years. They have apologized for their past treatment of Japanese Canadians, Chinese Canadians, and Indigenous Canadians. They apologized for sending Japanese Canadians to internment camps during World War II simply because they were Japanese.
Right or wrong committed against them 4 decades ago. It was during the Second World War, thousands of people were forced into internment camps simply because they were of Japanese descent. They've been waiting ever since for an official acknowledgement of the injustice, and today they got it. An apology from the Prime Minister and compensation for their losses. Former internees call it a settlement that heals. Wendy Mesley begins our coverage in August.
Then, later in 2006, apologized for the Chinese head tax that singled out Chinese immigrants willing to go to Canada for a better life.
Rise today to formally turn the page on an unfortunate period in Canada's past. A period during which a group of people who only sought to build a better life, were repeatedly and deliberately singled out for unjust treatment. I speak, of course, of the head tax that was imposed on Chinese immigrants to this country, as well as the other restrictive measures that followed.
Although Canada has made reconciliation efforts to repair the relationship between the government and the Indigenous communities, Indigenous people still get mistreated to this day, and the government is hardly doing anything to intervene. According to the 2016 Canadian census, 33.65% of those who identified as an Aboriginal person have no high school or equivalency certificate, compared to 18.3% of the rest of the Canadian population. In addition to the issues on the reserve, 44.2% of First Nations lived in a dwelling area that was needed of major repairs, compared to 6% of the non-Indigenous population living in such a condition. There have been links of health issues to First Nations and the lack of government care provided to them, as their income and social factors affect them mentally due to stress. They develop more health issues. In addition, people living in reserves have to continuously boil their water to get clean water to drink, and people who drink this poisonous water might develop health issues. Canada has become a better country in terms of racism towards communities and accepting other cultures, but issues with Indigenous communities' care by the government is still a concern. To sum it all up, Canada has become a better country in becoming more multicultural, less racist, but still, racism still exists in different communities all over Canada. Dealing with economic booms and downfalls have become better, although people might say that Canada after COVID-19 will face another economic downfall. And the role of women, accepting women and men in the workforce, has improved, but gender stereotypes still remain an issue. Thank you for watching and listening to my documentary. This was Malak Elghobashy, and I'll see you later.